He was on his way, and then the best of him, and he had to return. So we have 3 presentations. Our moderator is Professor Phil Cassanet, who's a distinguished professor of sociology, presidential professor of sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center. He also is one of the forces behind his new master's program in international migration studies. So just wanted to put that out there. It's been really great working with him on that. His more complete bio is in your booklet. And then if you want to learn even more about him, Google him and find his even more extensive and impressive bio blurb online. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Phil for further introductions while I'll get the PowerPoint slides ready. Okay? And 15 minutes each for the presentation. Okay, folks? All right, thanks.
You doing this here? Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Then I'll use this one. Well, I'm vamping for time while she gets this done. Very great honor to be here at the conclusion. I have to just say that I've been trying to use my NYC ID everywhere. And the one place, of course, it doesn't really work is for FAA stuff. But I still use it, and the only time I've gotten away with it, because I always try to do that at the airport to try to make a point, and was in Charlotte, North Carolina, no, Durham, North Carolina recently, where the guy looked at it and turned it over, and looked at it, turned it over, and he said, "Oh yeah, y'all don't have cars, right?" And he took it. So keep on with the NYCID. I think we'll just go in the order. As was mentioned, René Kirchhoff unfortunately is not joining us, which is too bad because I worked all last night on how to pronounce the difference between the Freie Universität Brüssel and the Freie Universität Berlin. Am I remotely close?
I'm Dutch, so especially the Brussels, Freie Universität.
Freie Universität. Very good. But we should go in the order presented. The distinguished panel can all get their bios in the booklet provided. But our first paper is by my old friend Sophia Aptekar and my colleague Amy Shin from UMass Boston and Queens College, respectively. So why don't you take it away?
How's this? Can you hear me? Great. I think Amy had to get coffee, emergency coffee. Today I'm going to be talking about an ongoing research project, and it's actually the very first time that Amy and I, also Holly Reed at Queens College, who's working on this project with us, are presenting very preliminary results. So definitely so interested in your questions and comments as we continue this work. To give you some background, undocumented youth are quite visible in the public sphere today, but it's a relatively recent phenomenon when you look at the history of immigrant rights struggles. Since mobilizing as a distinct group and fighting for the DREAM Act, undocumented youth played a key role in pressuring the Obama administration to create the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, DACA, if not the DREAM Act itself. And as part of this organizing, undocumented youth developed a particular narrative around immigrants who were brought to the United States by their parents at a young age. This narrative has since been critiqued as promoting, among other things, deservingness discourse that excludes not only immigrants who arrive as adults, but the parents of the youth, but also the youth arrivals who do not conform to the dreamer image. When DACA was passed in 2012 and implemented in subsequent years, it had kind of a demobilizing effect on some of the youth activists and organizing. the 2016 election and the rescinding of DACA that followed spurred on a renewed round of mobilization. So given this context of youth-led immigrant rights organizing, what we are looking at with our research study, among many other things, is looking not only at those undocumented youth who are activists, but also those who are not, and exploring the factors that keep undocumented youth from becoming involved, one, in immigrant rights organizing, or even just from connecting to institutionally supported programs for immigrant college students. Our studies focus specifically on CUNY students, City University of New York, and so we look at the programs that are organized at the college level for undocumented students as well. And then we wanted to consider also the consequences of not being involved in either organizing or more as a consumer of these programs. So our data comes from this ongoing research project. It's based on semi-structured interviews with current and former CUNY students who are or were undocumented or had DACA at some point while enrolled in college. So that's a mouthful. We have conducted about 72, probably a bit more since I sent this off, semi-structured interviews. And the way that we've been recruiting folks is through flyers, social media, working with advocacy organizations, and through snowball sampling. We began interviewing in mid-January this year, and we're still very much in the middle of conducting these interviews. So our presentation today is quite preliminary. Here's some of the characteristics of the people that we have talked to so far. We have more women than men, mostly quite young. And we do have many Latino respondents. At the same time, we also have a good number of Asian and Black respondents. And from CUNY administrative data that keeps track of all CUNY students and their immigration status, we know that the undocumented student population at CUNY is very diverse. So we know, for example, that there's roughly as many Asians as there are Latinos at CUNY who are undocumented. Most of our respondents have DACA, some do not. I think in all cases because they were, almost all cases because they're not eligible. They were not eligible either because they were too old or because they arrived past the cutoff point. So someone who came as a 10 or 11-year-old and is now at CUNY, now a college student, would have come too late and didn't qualify for DACA. And a few have been able to obtain legal permanent residency through marriage and other means. So that's who we've talked to. Now, very tentative findings as we continue to interview more and more people. So first, comparing undocumented youth who are either involved in youth-led activist organizing and or participating in college organized activities or programs, and those who are not, we kind of see that we notice a vicious cycle. So in many cases, students who are not involved are those who had no help at the high school level in terms of how to deal with their status of applying for college, paying for college. So for those of you who are outside the city, from outside the city, these students, even those who have DACA, they do not qualify for financial aid. So they have to pay the full CUNY tuition. They are often also those students who have lower grades, often because they're already working long hours, even in high school, and or because they're discouraged because they see no future for themselves. They don't find out about the scholarships that they're eligible for, some of which, like Dream.US, come with special programs. So not only do you get your tuition paid, but on a regular basis, you meet with an advisor, you have to go to meetings where you learn a little bit about what's available to you, and build some skills. So they're not in these programs, they're paying full tuition, often means they're working very long hours, they're only on campus for class, and they have little time to attend informational meetings or organizing meetings. And in many cases, these are the same students who fail classes or withdraw from classes, that go part-time, that drop out of college altogether for a period and then try to go back, or kind of downshift to a community college after studying a 4-year college, or drop out altogether. Another factor is not having DACA. So as I mentioned, we've interviewed quite a number of people who didn't qualify for DACA. If you think about it, especially in a college context, so much of the visible organizing right now is focused on DACA, including the programs that colleges themselves organize. So there'll be information sessions about know your rights, or legal assistance, or that's put on by a college campus, and it'll be advertised as being for DACA students, and it'll say that on the flyer. So some of the allies who are faculty and staff are not necessarily aware that there are large populations of youth on campus who do not have DACA. And some of them are, but they're kind of using the term DACA student to cover all, people who don't have DACA or who want DS and so on. So this is a quote. This is a quote from Kia. These are all opinions. So this is a quote from Kia, who was born in Botswana, and she came to the United States at the age of 13, so after the cutoff. She didn't qualify for DACA. And she said, we asked her whether she was involved in any of these groups on campus, like the Dream Team. She said, I think last year is when I actually saw it being the flyers for the Dream Team. Also, I don't check my emails that often, but sometimes I would check it, and I would see, oh, there's DACA this, some event about DACA. And then I'm like, oh, that's cool that they have that. And I followed up by asking, but nothing you actually went to? She said, no, I didn't go because I'm just like, I don't qualify. So not having DACA could be also a barrier when a lot of the organizing, a lot of the services are sold as being for DACA. We also found that both the active spaces and even the events that are put on by colleges to assist undocumented students were racialized in a specific way, and that is by that they were often viewed as Latino spaces. So we heard this not just from non-Latinos who said, oh, I don't go to those meetings, those are from Latinos. We heard it from Latino students as well, who characterized these events and organizations as being having a heavy Latino presence and kind of engaging with Latino culture and language. And those who were not Latino, I have an example from Julia. Julia came to the United States from Germany, and she's the daughter of immigrant parents in Germany from Turkey and Iran. And she came at age 11, which also made her not eligible for DACA. So we asked her whether she was involved with the Dream Team on her campus. And I'm not going to read this long quote, but I'll let you just read it. So here's a student who actually went to one of these events, and that was her kind of experience of it, and she hadn't gone again because she just really saw that space as not being for her. So some of the Korean youth that we've interviewed had a unique path to involvement in both immigrant rights advocacy, also just getting services from themselves. And it wasn't through campus-based groups or college-sponsored assistance programs, but it was through the Minkwon Center. The Minkwon Center is a large advocacy organization in Queens. A lot of the younger respondents, their parents would bring them to Minkwon to help apply for DACA or renew their DACA. And that became a source of information and assistance. Many got involved in advocacy in youth groups, and some were even hired by Minkwon. So this is a quote from Chris. Chris was born in Korea and came to the United States as a toddler. And basically, he's a bit older than our average, and he did not get DACA until his senior year in college. And he was like not seeing a future and thinking he was going to go back to Korea, and his Korean was not really great. And so he actually went to Minkwon to improve his Korean before possibly going back to Korea. Then something else happened. So quote. So that was kind of an alternative route for a lot of the Korean youth that we spoke with. So far, we're seeing some distinct consequences of not being involved in organizing or in programs geared towards immigrant youth. So youth who are not connected to these do not learn about scholarship opportunities. Some are even paying out-of-state tuition when they are qualified for in-state tuition, which is a lot more expensive. They did not have a chance to go on study abroad trips for advanced parole program, which for some means that they gave up a chance to legalization later. I'm going to explain that in Q&A. They don't necessarily they haven't received all the legal assistance that they could have. And their involvement really shapes how youth explain their lives and situations. So their narratives about themselves as CUNY students and as undocumented people. So I'm going to show you quotes from two students that we've interviewed. One who was a non-disclosure, didn't talk about her status very much, and was not involved in anything or even getting very many services, and one that was an activist. So the first is, I hope you can see that. You can probably also look at these screens. So the first is Sherry, who was born in Guyana and came to the U.S. at the age of 7. So notice also what she calls herself. She calls herself illegal throughout the interview. And so we asked her why she, what are some of the reasons that she doesn't disclose her status. And, she doesn't want to inconvenience people and make her feel really bad. And this is Lucy, who was born in Mexico and came to the U.S. at the age of 9. And that's her analysis of some of what CUNY could be doing. So for those folks outside of CUNY, ASAP is an assistance program for low-income students that gives you, among other things, like Metro card to come to school. So we're seeing this difference in how our respondents are explaining their situation, explaining their lives, but also what claims they make as students of their community colleges, which is very interesting. So I know I'm reaching a time limit. So that's what we have so far. As I mentioned, ongoing studies, so a really great opportunity for us to get your feedback this early on.
Our next speaker, and I should just say for the moment that you'll notice that these papers actually all fit together extremely well, because they're really different pieces of a very similar situation. Our next speaker is Fanny Laube from William Patterson College.
Thank you. So I know a lot of people have things else. I just want to echo that again. A graduate of CUNY. I used to teach at William College, so it's always really nice to come back for these conferences. My paper today is on gender inequality in the undocumented youth movement, and I think it's going to echo very well the presentation that we just saw about some of the challenges for undocumented youth to become politically active, but also why some people would choose not to stay active in the movement. So I just want to start with a couple of quotes from a New Jersey activist and a New York activist. And when I started this research, I wasn't really looking, I didn't plan on focusing on gender issues, but those issues kept coming up interview after interview. So this is some of the comments that I would collect. So a New Jersey activist said a lot of that campaign, and she's talking about the 2012-2013 campaign for in-state tuition and state financial aid for undocumented youth in New Jersey. And so she said a lot of that campaign was led by men. They would be the ones who had all the political relationships. They'd be on TV. They'd be the ones whose faces were on newspaper articles. But in terms of the grunt work of organizing, everything was done by women. And then a New York activist from a completely different organization mentioned, when describing her organization, said it's all women or queer men. It's the truth that's universal. Any straight man you deal with, it's all about power. And so she actually said, if you see someone on TV, do not trust them. Like, that's not who's doing the work. And so those are some of the comments that I kept getting during those interviews. And these are just some of, if you Google, undocumented activist rallies or DREAM Act rallies or anything like this, you'll see it's like that quote from Tarika's paper, we're the ones who are out front, right? And you actually see that during all of these. These are from some of the recent movements on DACA. So we know from literature on social movements that even though women have always been part of social movements, their participation has been historically ignored or recognized much, much later after said movements. Women face specific challenges when becoming politically active. So if you follow the resource model of participation, women do not have access to the same resources that men do in terms of time, in terms of civic skills, in terms of preparation. Women tend also to be face occupational segregation, and as a result do not have the same resources as men in terms of becoming politically active, especially in terms of taking the time and having the money to be politically active. Women also face issues related to mobility, and also women have a lot of reproductive responsibilities and a lot of family-related responsibilities, which prevent them from participating as much as men do. Immigrant women, though, have been, there's this distinction for immigrant movements where women historically have had leadership role in these particular movements. And so for this particular research, I draw a lot on the literature on the participation of Latina immigrants, because a lot of the participants in the study are Latinas. And so I'm focusing on the New York and New Jersey campaigns from 2012 and 2013. So in New Jersey, it was for in-state tuition and state financial aid. In-state tuition was passed at the time, and state financial aid was vetoed by the then governor. State financial aid, however, was recently adopted in the state, so we'll see how well it will be implemented in the coming years. And in New York, the campaign was for state financial aid, which still hasn't been adopted. So these activists face challenges related to race, class, age, and immigration status. So a lot of discussions coming in. One of the issues I became interested in when I did my second round of interviews, and I'll talk about the data in a minute, was the post-movement outcomes, because I conducted a second set of interviews with activists a couple of years after those campaigns. And so it's really interesting to see what happens to these youth activists after the campaign. And so we know from the literature, there's a lot of research on the skills, the political efficacy, the political knowledge, and social capital that activists do receive. But most of the literature focuses on how those skills are applied to future campaigns. And but there's very little to be found about actual economic gains or economic opportunities for activists after their campaigns, especially when we're talking about college students or high school students. And so I was interested in employment opportunities for these activists and educational opportunities. When you think about, when colleges make scholarships available for extraordinary service to your community and things like that. So the research questions for this project are: how did gender issues surface in each campaign, either while the campaign was ongoing or after the campaign, in terms of what happened to these activists after the campaign? To what extent were those issues addressed in each campaign in New York and in New Jersey? Did activists or did campaign leaders acknowledge that there were gender issues? And did they actually take steps to rebalance gender roles? And then finally, my question was, what made a campaign or movement more likely to address gender issues? My data comes from really two stages of the data collection. A lot of it was collected while I was doing my dissertation at the Grad Center. I did observation and participant observation in 2012 and 2013, and at the time I did 60 interviews with Latino undocumented youth, so it was very specific to that group, half of whom were women. And then in 2015 I did additional interviews with immigrant youth activists in both states, 20 of whom were women. Then I did interviews with community organizers or professional organizers, 16 of whom were women. And then I also did interviews with elected officials or senior staff, 6 of whom were women. And so you can see here that the gender breakdown kind of matches what you'd expect to see, where there's an overrepresentation of women amongst the activists, but an underrepresentation of women amongst elected officials. So here are some of the gender issues that came up in both campaign. One was simply the lack of available time to participate for young women, and this kind of aging out of the movement once family responsibilities kick in. So here's a New York activist who says, she kind of recalled how active she had been in the previous years, but now that she had a baby, she described her former activities as something of kind of a single life kind of thing, where you don't have necessarily any responsibilities, and also you're not making any money. And once you have a child, you do need to make that money. Another issue that came up in both campaign was the imbalance in terms of the work responsibility. And so that's something that was seen in both campaign, where activists, male and female, did note that there was this underrepresentation of women as sort of the faces of the movements. In New York, someone said there's more women than men, and women do everything. And in New Jersey, there was this really imbalance in terms of who was doing the background work, who was staying up late, who was setting up meetings, who was setting up the carpools to go to Trenton and things like that, as opposed to the male activists, who were much more likely to be the ones in contact with elected officials and therefore contacted by media. So there was this imbalance in both campaigns. New Jersey had very specific issues. New Jersey had issues related to sexual harassment within the movement, and so that is something that did not come up in 2013, but was commented on in 2015. And it was the fact that it wasn't discussed in 2013 was explained to me because a lot of these activists didn't really realize what was going on, and also didn't expect that something like that would happen to them in such a progressive movement. And so there was this kind of shock and need for time to realize what was going on. And so this is something that was brought up in the New Jersey campaign. And then there was the post-campaign outcome differentiation, where activists noted how the male activists in the campaigns hadn't gotten jobs as professional activists following the campaigns, or had gotten scholarships or jobs, whereas most of the female activists in the campaign had gone back to school, but nothing really had changed in terms of their career trajectory. And I have here a quote from an elected official in New Jersey, because I did interviews with elected officials, and I asked them, who came to see you? Do you remember them? And at the time, my primary question was, was it a diverse group that was there, or was it mostly Latino activists, because that's what I was looking at. But systematically was male activists who were mentioned by the representatives, by the elected officials. And this particular one says she recalled a story of that, the story that brought them to this issue, and she kept changing, saying, oh, this is what happened to this student, she was doing this, he was doing this. And she said, I can't remember the gender, but I remember the story. And so kind of the individual characteristics of the story no longer mattered. What mattered was that the story, the dreamer story that we all know. So in terms of addressing these issues, in both states, the issue of gender imbalance was rarely addressed during the campaign itself. And so in New York, one of the activists said it's a woman-led organization, but that's not something that we publicly state, right? Everybody knows it, but that's not how we advertise ourselves. That's not how we brand ourselves, essentially. And in New Jersey, it was the same. The issue was not discussed while the campaign was ongoing. The entire focus was on the specific legislative goal. After the campaign, however, there was a difference there because in New Jersey, the issue was discussed after the campaign. So one of the New Jersey activists was talking about one of the male activists during that time and said he got a women's rights lessons throughout this movement because now he's so much better at recognizing his own male privilege, sharing the light line, and respecting boundaries. And so these issues were specifically addressed during the after the campaign in New Jersey. So in terms of what makes a movement more likely, more or less likely to address these issues, the primary factor is experience, right? These are young people who, for the most part, have no prior experience with political activism, and so there's this kind of naive approach where you don't really want to focus on this because the legislative goal is so important. So experience does matter. Once you've had experience with this, you're much more likely to address it. Organizational support also matters. So in New Jersey, for example, the campaign, once it was kind of disbanded, the female members of the campaign met with a long-time community organizer in New Jersey, a female community organizer, who sat them down and specifically discussed that with them. So they had an entire retreat about this, and they've decided to reconfigure their campaign moving on. And so another factor that allows them to address these issues is how to structure their movement and what kind of policies they want to establish for the movement itself. And so one of the things that they've done in the new organization in New Jersey is having horizontal leadership and task management so that a single individual does not have the entire resources like connections to elected official or connections to the media, but these tasks are shared so that one individual member can be cut out, and also so that way if the member is cut out, the movement does not lose all of its resources. The new organization also has the zero tolerance policy, and so gender issues are openly discussed, and so having that new culture helps set up a better balance of work. Just to conclude, I want to say, it's important to examine the experiences of female activists both during and after the campaign in terms of what challenges they face, how they cope with these particular challenges, and what kind of policies can be put in place to prevent these gender disparities. But we also need more literature on the post-campaign outcomes for activists, especially young activists. Thank you.
So, Saya, did you want to provide some comments to find out?
Our final speaker is Danielle Pila from the State University of Albany.
Brian and Perla have been seriously dating for 3 years. Perla had never explicitly explained her undocumented status to her boyfriend. Brian would ask her how she came to the US, but she would allude to a vague situation. She never really explained what happened. One summer, Brian invited her to go to Italy with him, his sister, and her wife, but Perla made up some excuse of not being able to go because of work, or something like that. During their Italy trip, Brian kept wishing Perla was with them because he wanted to show her all of their adventures. After the Italy trip, he finally sat down with Perla and asked her point blank, "Okay, what happened with your legal status?" She finally told him her story. She was filled with hiya, or shame, over her legal status. She kept calling it her situation. Perla suspects that this is why he proposed to her a month later. "I really didn't want to get married," she admitted, even though she admits also that it was the easiest way to legalize my status, and it's so frustrating. In 2006, 870,000 undocumented the Commission of Filipino Overseas estimated that 870,000 undocumented Filipinos worldwide. Of the 11 million estimated undocumented people in the United States, 11% are of Asian descent, And of those, 270,000 are undocumented Filipinos in the United States. The U.S. is 68% of the 4 million Filipinos in the United States. 68% of foreign-born Filipinos in 2013 are naturalized citizens, but while 66% of Filipinos are legal permanent residents. So most of the literature on Filipino immigrants has primarily focuses on second generation with U.S. citizenship, but has largely ignored the lived experiences of those in between who are either undocumented or liminally legal. So that's kind of the setup for my project, for my dissertation. And all the names I use and all the details that I use have been changed, so if you want to try to track them, you won't. Just so to let you guys know. And so primarily, as my title says, I was looking at how legal status affects ethnic identity formation in Filipino immigrant young adults. So I'll just jump into the methodology because I want to get to the stories. So I did semi-structured interviews, 2 to 3 hours with 54 immigrant young adults, all based in New York, New Jersey, greater metropolitan area between 21 and 32 years old. There's an asterisk, so you can totally ask me after why there's an asterisk there. These are the 4 legal status groups that I interviewed: 20 U.S. citizens, 13 legal permanent residents, non-immigrant visa holders, 14, and 7 undocumented immigrants. I did snowball sampling. Pretty much if there was an event in New York City that had Filipino in it, I was basically there. Sometimes I would follow my participants. I did a lot of karaoke, just a lot of informal weak ties. For this project, it was actually better not to, unlike my esteemed colleagues here, it was better to recruit through informal ties as opposed to organizational work, just because it was such a sensitive topic already within the Filipino immigrant community. These were my questions. But basically, I just wanted to, it was like a really long first date. It was like 3 hours long. I also did, I mentioned I went to a lot of participant observation, and it's, and again, some of them I followed participants, some of them I didn't. But overall, I wanted to get a sense of how did the Filipino community in New York and New Jersey perceive themselves, and from that, how did the people I interviewed perceive their community, whatever that was. And so I started this project with the idea of ethnic identity formation, and I had it initially, if you notice, I started collecting data September 2016. What happened to November 2016? Yay! So, of course, I have to add about Trump. And oftentimes, that was actually the first thing people would talk to me about, that as soon as they saw my recruitment stuff, they were like, do you know anything about Trump? Do you think I'm going to get deported? So that most of the time, especially for non-citizens, this was the first question, or they wanted to ask me things about Trump and their rights and whatnot. And so this is kind of the basis of my presentation today. So Regina is 22 years old. She is a college student. She's a major in psychology. And I met her kind of randomly. I literally was at a Starbucks putting up flyers, and I kind of racially guessed she was Filipino, so I just kind of like, hey, we're recruiting Filipinos, and it turned out she was. So I met her in a super random way, and then so we ended up meeting, and so she told me her story. She was born in the U.S. territory, and so that's how she was able to, she's a U.S. citizen, she came to the United States. And because Regina works at Starbucks, she is always, and where she lived is very, it's New York City. It's very diverse. So people often ask her, "What are you?" So people always ask, "I thought you were Thai. I thought you were Vietnamese. I thought you were Korean." All these different ethnicities, and she said, "Sometimes I do get that Filipino. It's like various ethnicities, In public spaces, and her ethnicity would change completely depending on where she was. So she's Vietnamese and Thai at her workplace. But in public spaces, people would speak her in Chinese, people would speak her in Spanish. There's other languages she didn't know, so she had no idea what the other ones were. She just understood Spanish and Chinese. So Filipino immigrants, whether you're a citizen or not, were able to kind of benefit from this racial ambiguity because people didn't quite know what you were. So there was this racial ambiguity. Filipino immigrants in my study also benefited from the positive stereotypes of model minority, as is often with Asian immigrants. So Rod is 28 years old. He's a permanent resident, and he works as a home caregiver. So he takes care of elderly people. I met him through his cousin. He's my only Skype interview in my study. So he talks to me about being in. I asked him, "Oh, what's it like to be Filipino?" And he said, oh, I prefer to be actually identified as Filipino compared to Asian. I said, why? If I claim to be Asian, there's plenty of types of Asians. And he says that his being Filipino is a positive stereotype for employers, because specifically he works with elderly and home care. And so when they ask me what my race is, and again, they kind of they confuse like race, and they just like say race, whatever, and they say Filipino. It's not a race, but whatever. They always say Filipino. And so he goes on to tell a story about how his black coworker was doing the same thing that Regina experienced of, what are you? And Rod said very proudly, oh, I'm Filipino. And his black coworker said, that's why you work really well. All of my coworkers in his previous job was in a nursing home were Filipino. So that's why I didn't think of you as Filipino. So I think this is kind of like an insult compliment. Like, I'm not really sure like why he thought this was positive, but in his mind, this was a positive thing, because he said, oh, I'm a hardworking Filipino caregiver, right? So the Filipino immigrants in my study benefit from this racial ambiguity. So they're not. I only have one participant who is half Latino, half Filipino, and he says people racialize him depending on how he parts his hair. So if he parts his hair in a Latino way, he's racialized as Latino, and of all my participants, he's the only one who's had a hostile encounter at the subway. So most of them, they kind of just, people don't really know what they are, so they don't experience much racial discrimination on the ground. Bea, and because of this, Bea is 23 years old. She is hold on. Okay, so she works for a European company, media company, and so I can't say because you'll figure out if I say. So it's a UK/European company. So she's on a European visa in the United States, so something like that. And she talks about how she feels that Filipinos are better off than her compared to Latino and African Americans. Well, to be honest, I feel compared to to Hispanic people, I feel we're treated better. Because when we say undocumented, you're always thinking Hispanic. There's this sort of branding, and the reason why she's saying that is a couple of her coworkers, European coworkers on European visas, were their employers terminated their contract, so they had to. The contract was terminated, and they're European, so they had to go home right away. Like they had leases, yearly leases. They just had to give that all up, the deposit and everything. So that's where she's coming from. And maybe because most of the Filipinos that I know, their immigration stories are successful because they end up getting married, or they end up, finding another way to stay in the United States. And she's referring to the fact that Filipinos have large access to family sponsorship, employment-based visas, and it's kind of relating to what Rod was saying, that you can come to the United States as a nurse because we've been kind of racialized as good workers or good caregivers. And she doesn't really know any undocumented people. Perla is undocumented. She's the story that I started off the presentation with. And Perla, as the Filipino stereotype, she's actually a nurse. She passed the NCLEX, and she came to the United States as a tourist visa. She was trying to find work. She had a family friend who said, okay, I'll employ you in my nursing home. But when she did come to the United States, the employer said, what are you talking about? I'm not going to sponsor you. You're going to work for me under the table. And so she was promised employment, sponsorship and employment, and she got neither, actually. So Perla meets her fiance in New York City, and they were dating for 3 years. So this is a big thing to not tell somebody about your immigration status. She mentions that Brian, her fiance, kind of figured it out, but until they have that talk 3 years in, he really didn't know. So she talks a lot about how her heart broke when Trump won the presidency. He proposed sometime before Trump won. Oh my God, shocks. This is like Filipino, like shocks. Trump won. What's going to happen? Of course, the fear is still there. What's going to happen to me? Instead of having a chance to fix my papers, maybe I'll lose my chance even more. At this point, when Trump won, her fiance said, I have to sponsor you. You can't be detained or deported. There's that fear of getting deported or being detained or experiencing racism up front. And it's interesting because in the next sentence, she says, I'm in New York City. I know this city is a very open, liberal place, so I won't experience racism. And then in the next sentence, but some of my Filipino friends went to Starbucks and they were called, go back to Mexico or something. Yeah, they were Filipino and I haven't experienced that, which is a good thing, but I feel like, oh my gosh, shucks, I'm really a minority here. So she's realizing that, and she used to live in the Midwest. So for her, moving to New York, New Jersey was, it was such a different experience from living in the Midwest. But then when Trump won, she felt that her experience, it kind of negated all the benefits of moving to a liberal state, especially with her friends' experiences with racism. So I conclude that in this politicized racial landscape of U.S. immigration issues, Filipinos benefit from racial ambiguity and the model minority myth because we have racialized the media, politicians, lobbyists, activists have racialized undocumented immigration as specifically a Latino issue, even if 11% of, and the largest net migration from Mexico is negative. People are going back to Mexico. The largest segment of the undocumented population are from Asia, and it's only predicted to increase over time. So even though this issue, and also it also affects Filipinos in terms of length of time waiting for their family sponsorships. So some people in my study have to wait, they are eligible for family sponsorship, but it takes them 15, 20, 30 years to be sponsored. So even if you do benefit from being Filipino, it doesn't actually benefit everybody equally. And even though they perceive themselves as better off compared to Latino or African Americans, they actually experience many of the same problems, if not worse, because they are not talked about as a segment of the population that is significantly affected by undocumented immigration or immigration reform, comprehensive reform, immigration reform in general. And oftentimes with my non-immigrant visa holders, I'll tell them, oh, when are you gonna, do you think you're gonna apply for LPR, legal permanent residence? And they say, oh, if it happens, if not, I'll just go home. So they're not understanding that they have this right because they are eligible through their citizenship and nationalism, but they just don't perceive it. It's just a system, this is the way it is. And the Trump presidency has forced Filipino and Filipino Americans, regardless of their legal status, to question the stability of their citizenship and or their immigration status and their human rights. So even if you are legal, Bea, who is a legal immigrant non-visa holder, is questioning. She's not sure if she should stay in the United States. She doesn't know what her plan is. She's afraid of being deported, just like her European colleagues. And she was like, they're European and they got deported. What about me? I'm Filipino. And also many of so I did my U.S. citizens I found U.S. citizens faster, obviously, for my study. And after Trump won, many of them came up to me and said, "Do you think my citizenship will get revoked?" They wanted me to assure them that they would not lose their U.S. citizenship, even if they were born in the United States and or they were naturalized. So the status of legal status, whether citizenship is not guaranteed. Minority status kind of supersedes this fear of losing your human rights.
What I really like about these three papers is that they are very much three cuts and angles on something that's quite similar in some ways. We have a probability sample of the entire group, or a large, pan-ethnic group of people who are undocumented, some of whom are in DACA, some of whom are not, and we're thinking about, well, what determines the various roads people take. Then we have a study of people who become active through the process. And of course, in comparing the two papers, what I was first thinking about is, okay, there are consequences to being an activist. Activism itself changes the game. And yet, at the same time, there's also, as the previous paper showed, consequences to not being involved and not being active. And how does that shape statuses as well? So by actually selecting on the one side of this, you get a much deeper idea about what does being active mean, and how does that change the way people are thinking about gender, and thinking about leadership, and thinking about things that basically where does one fit? And then, of course, in the final paper, we're thinking about one particular ethnic segment. Okay, and that's particularly interesting because one of the things that is striking about so much of the material on undocumented immigrants is that there are undocumented immigrants are an extraordinarily diverse category, and yet much of the activism and much of the public image is about certain groups, which gets other groups saying, well, I'm not really undocumented, or I'm undocumented sorta, but it's shameful, but it's stigmatized, but maybe I'm really not. And part of this is, different routes into the country. You feel undocumented if you actually illegally cross the border without inspection. But very few Filipinos do that. Almost all Filipinos are coming in on a legal visa, and so they had a piece of paper, and then that changed at a certain point, but, you don't really feel like, and Amy Kulker, a graduate student of mine who's just finished a study on Filipino childcare workers, was struck by the fact that many felt, okay, I've been undocumented, but the anti-undocumented ideas are not about me. Because I work, I'm not hurting anybody, I'm not crossing a border. Obviously, if I was crossing a border, you could get caught, and I'm not in a really ethnic enclave kind of workplace, and therefore, it's really unlikely that it'll affect me. Now, what I think is running through all of these papers, although Danielle is the only one who actually made it very specific, but the specter that is haunting all of your work is Donald Trump, And what changed in November 2016? Because in some ways, that whole question of, I'm not really undocumented, those people are like undocumented, the racialization versus the legal status, that they're both kind of negotiating here, where that line is, kind of may have shifted. And suddenly there's a fear on the part of a lot of people who thought racial status or ethnic status was trumping legal status, and now it's not clear that that's going to be the case. So I was really very struck by how that worked out. Actually a couple of very specific questions. Well, one comment, it's also very interesting that Starbucks has become the new public agora in which public negotiations of racial and ethnic things seem to be worked out. I think there's a whole Starbucksology in the last couple of weeks we've got to work on. With Daniela's paper, I was also struck by, it is true that the large majority of Filipinas and Filipinos are not undocumented, but a lot of Filipino and Filipinas were undocumented at some point during their immigration history. And they've been much more successful than other groups at moving in and out of various statuses for complicated reasons. It'd be interesting to think about, as things get tighter and more difficult, what that's going to mean. For Amy and Sophia, which is a really just a fascinating paper, and it's going to tell us all kinds of interesting things about this population. It was really interesting to think of DACA as kind of a privilege, and that in some ways the students who qualified for DACA or were able to obtain it had certain kinds of advantages, or often did. That allowed them to be in a different situation than some others. And the ways in which others would think of DACA as, or stigmatized identity. And so the sort of identity things that were going on there. And I was particularly struck by this whole question of the extent to which DACA reifies a kind of a discourse of deservingness. There's the good immigrants and the bad immigrants. And if you think about, and it's a very difficult political question, because the reason that for a long time we thought DACA had the best shot, in fact that the DREAM Act had the best shot of all the things we could do about immigrants, it was because, well, there was this argument that these people are in this status through no fault of their own. And there's even an awful lot of Republicans who buy that. And the reason that that's powerful is because there is this very clear sense of fault and no fault of their own. But of course the implication is that then there are other immigrants who are somehow at fault, And for a lot of the leaders of the Dreamer movement, this presented a real dilemma, in that how much should we accept rights if it means it's going to make it easier to deport other people? And the other people are, of course, sometimes our siblings and our parents. So this gets really very, very tricky. And we came very close to having a real split and a real terrible dilemma within the movement. Because Trump at one point was offering to expand not just to the Dreamers, but to about 1.8 million people who could remotely qualify in exchange for really horrible stuff for everybody else. And do you take that or not? I mean, there was going to be a real fight in that movement over that. Then, of course, Trump and his friends fucked it up, and now we have unity once again because nobody's getting anything. But we came pretty close, you know, to being in a situation that was going to be a real moral and ethical question, which is always the case in social movements. And that gets us back to Fanny's paper, which I think is really particularly intriguing in that it really brings to mind what it means to be in a movement and start to rethink things in terms of one's dealing with. I mean, at one point we were talking in the paper, in the slides, about the difference between being involved in issues versus values. And is this a total social transformation, or are we going to win on this issue? And of course, in social movements, inevitably what ends up happening is the people who are the most involved in leadership really start to see this as a total transition of values. And then there's this deep disappointment that comes when it finds out that most of the rank and file were just interested in the issue, you know. And that kind of thing, because consciousness gets raised, and thinking about gender issues gets raised, and thinking about other kinds of issues gets raised in the process. And what are the results of that, particularly for a movement full of young people? And I'm very, very struck at how within the Dreamer movement, the ideas that are ironically very often very American, and the product of American social movements, have had a huge impact on the young people involved. I mean, clearly the model of the civil rights movement is absolutely critical in people's thinking, but also increasingly models that come out of movements for queer empowerment and models that come out of feminism. You know, often things that are quite different from probably the ideas that these people entered the movement with, or sometimes that their parents actually hold not exactly those issues. You know, people from quite traditional backgrounds are suddenly confronting that need for the movement, which is ironic because in some ways it's a huge sign of assimilation. Think about how much they've come to share a lot of values from American societies. The way in which, for example, the idea of coming out, made a transition from the gay movement and queer empowerment things into the Dreamer movement. And I'm certain that many of their parents saw that as pretty odd. So in any event, I think that this really raises the question then of, what's going to happen in the future. And of course, it is a long run in terms of these folks, and they're very young. But how it is that will reshape their ability to do politics and their ability to do trade-offs. And if we ever get to a point where we actually are able to exact the trade-off, how we make those decisions. Is it going to make it harder to take half a loaf? To say, okay, this is not perfect, but it's the compromise we're going to get, and it's going to make things work better. Does that become harder? And those of us who've been involved in various movements, can all think of moments when exactly that happened, and the very committed activists were unable to take half a loaf, but maybe it was the right thing to do. Anyway, these are fabulous papers, and I want to give everyone a chance to respond to me, but first maybe we should get some comments from the audience. Please.
I had a question for Daniela. So from your research, could you speak a bit to the wider question of families with split legal statuses? Because many families come here, kids are born here, but the brothers and sisters don't have documents, are undocumented. And sort of tie that in within how that then constructs issues of their view of their ethnic identity. and how that then contrasts with their sense of being American, or how they see themselves as being American.
Alright, so almost, I think besides the U.S. citizens, almost all of my sample are mixed status families. Like, you know, it's a very normal story that the parent was here, they have 3 kids, they can only sponsor one kid, you know, because they were under 21, and then the older siblings are left in the Philippines. So it creates this, you know, transnational family where, and it's interesting because, you know, I asked them, oh, so you're okay with that? And they're like, yeah, they have their own lives in the Philippines. And then later on, they're like, oh, like my mom gets really upset that my sister is in the Philippines and can't come here for Christmas. Or why do we have to choose between spending Christmas in the Philippines or the U.S.? Why can't we, you know, why can't they just come here? And it's interesting because within the same family, they think it's okay. Like, they don't actually, like, they're not angry. It's very different from the, you know, undocumented, unafraid Latino movement where it's like, no, it's not okay to have families separated. But the Filipino case, at least from my study, they're kind of like, yeah, that's just the way it is. And so the way they form their ethnic identity is that it's very victim blaming, actually. It's like, oh, if my parents didn't choose to sponsor me, then, you know, what would our lives be like? That I would be my siblings, and oftentimes, especially with siblings, they're very close to each other. So I remember one interviewee who was, she met her husband, he was in the military, and then they married, and she actually delayed her migration for a year because she didn't want to be separated from her family. That even though she loved her spouse, it was really hard for her to choose between her husband and her family. And she knew that eventually she could sponsor them, so she decided to come to the United States. But it's hard because you have to make these decisions, right? Like, who do I leave behind? And in terms of, I haven't like looked into much about how that in particular affects their ethnic identity, but definitely the way Filipino immigrants in my study are like, that's just the way it is. Like, you know, and you have to consider, like, the Philippines had Marcos dictatorship, right? So we're coming from, the parents, my parents' generation come from an era where you don't talk about politics ever. So a lot of the, and I specifically interviewed non-activists. So they're not these woke people that are like, down with the regime, you know, like they're not thinking in that way. They're more like, what regime? Like, you know, they don't really understand these you know, institutional forces that are happening. So, thank you for your question.
Oh, hi, my name is Jimin. My question is specifically towards Professor Sophie Optigar and Professor Amy Khan. So I do think that it's really interesting that undocumented immigrants have limited access to scholarships. And from my understanding, I do know that these scholarships are very competitive because it's very limited. And I just want to know that are there instances where undocumented immigrants, especially those who qualify for these scholarships, applied for them but were denied or rejected because they were not competitive enough or that they didn't have good grades within the applicant pool. So I thought that that's my question. Thank you.
And that's a great question, and there are tons, there's a large number of those we interviewed who did apply for scholarships and either, you know, didn't get some of them or all of them because they are very competitive. And what happens is, you know, with some of these scholarships like Dream.us, you get channeled, you know, they kind of pick the top students and you get channeled to this programming that lasts throughout your college career that really helps. But also, in a way, CUNY is using these students as the face of undocumented students at CUNY, right? And they're expected to advocate and be, you know, like, meet with politicians and be interviewed by the media. So they're doing a lot of the labor in exchange for these scholarship opportunities, right? And we've interviewed some folks who are in those situations, and some of them are quite conflicted about it, about having to perform that labor and what it means for students who didn't get these scholarships for a variety of reasons. And speaking of like situations within the family, part of our study is interviewing siblings when we can. And you have situations where a sibling didn't get these scholarships, and the sibling is paying full tuition, is dropping out of school, and is really struggling So definitely that's a really important issue.
Also, CUNY is in this particular position where if the money is coming from public funds, it can't be used for to fund undocumented students. But they also have funds that come from private donors. And so they have these pockets of money that can be used, but they don't want to publicize it because they're afraid that if they start publicizing it, it will anger donors. It will anger, perhaps it will garner too much attention from the federal government, and then the federal government has, threatened to pull Pell Grants, and 70% of CUNY students qualify for Pell Grants, right? So they're in this particular situation where they have this pocket of money, but they don't want to, talk about it too publicly. And through different channels, they do use it on occasion, and with people we talk to give scholarships to students. But these are, these are the students that they become aware of because these are the self-disclosures, the ones that are, participating and being activists, right? So this is another consequence of when you out yourself, when you are public, and then this case of a student who didn't know how he was going to pay for college, and a week before classes were enrolled, he still didn't know how, and then he just got this email that said, "Congratulations, we found this pocket of money for you," and this is, there are cases like that as well.
I do have to interject here because it's a pet peeve. CUNY, of course, makes a big deal about the fact that we do have these funds, although they try to keep it relatively quiet, that aren't state funds that we will then dedicate to undocumented students. But graduate students are not eligible for these funds. Yeah. And even though they make a big, nobody would be denied an education because they don't have blah, blah, blah. Every time I've gone in and said, yeah, but what about this graduate student that I'm trying to fund? And you get a lot of blank stares and people looking at their shoes. And, and I think at somewhere along the line, the decision was made that undergraduates are the students struggling, deserving, have to, people getting doctorates, that's kind of like a hobby. What do you do? and a real unwillingness to subsidize that. And it's very striking because I fought this with particular Dreamer graduate students almost every year for the last 5 or 6 years. And it's a real great way not to let the people in CUNY Central, they don't return your calls. Well, at least they stop returning mine. So, anyway.
Hi, thank you all for your work. So I work on the high school end of college access, and something that we see, it's more of an anecdote, not so much a question, but we have kind of a segment, so most of our students, if not all of them, are not eligible for DACA. They came here quite a few years after the policy. One thing that we see though is this group of students who are like semi-documented, in the sense where they have an asylum claim that's pending. So in many cases they have a social security number that only allows them, that's only good for work, which obviously is huge, but that prevents them from being able to access financial aid. Obviously they can't use that social security number. They're not considered to be an eligible non-citizen as it works for the FAFSA or for New York State TAP application. So while they're able to prove and show New York State residency with their high school diploma and attend CUNY and get charged in-state tuition rate, they're not able to access local state financial aid. The other thing we see often is with students who, let's say, are applying for special immigrant juvenile status, where their case has been approved at the family court piece, but is being held up in immigration court. And obviously now, similar with asylum, the backlog is tremendous. So it's also this kind of, it puts us, my advising team, in an awkward, to say at the very least, position, and often heartbreaking position of how do we just say, how often can we say and just repeat, let's wait, let's hope for good news, call your attorney again, let's see, let's strategize. It does help us try to think a little more creatively, but that has a shelf life as well, obviously. So I was just curious, and I guess for our professors from the first paper, kind of this idea though of someone being semi-documented. I mean, in a sense you could say DACA is that as well, right? It's a stopgap, because you're not eligible for financial aid either. But I was curious if that has come up at all, that idea for you.
I think definitely in the sense that although like these categories seem pretty distinct on paper, in reality it's a lot more complicated, and people are falling in and out of status and moving between statuses, especially now with the major delays, right? And it just really throws a wrench in an already really difficult college application process, and I'm sure you know. Kind of listening to you describe what's happening on your end is very interesting for us, because we ask a lot of questions about what happens in high school, and some of our respondents express, some get no help, right? So I'm so glad to hear that folks like you are out there. But the ones that do sometimes get really frustrated with a little bit of what you brought up, with being told that it'll work out and there's scholarships for you out there, because sometimes they seek kind of the legitimation of an adult saying like, this really sucks and it's really unfair if there isn't something for you right now. I don't know. It's very preliminary, as I said, like no interviews, but that is the thread that I'm seeing in the people that I've talked to.
I actually think this is really interesting and important, especially for the Chinese population, because DACA take-up rates among those who are eligible, 70% of Mexicans take up DACA. Only 30% of South Koreans, even though they're actually the largest undocumented Asian population in CUNY. Less than 1% of Chinese do, and so have applied for DACA. And that's a puzzle. That's a great mystery we're trying to understand tonight. But I think one of the things is that historically they've been able to apply for asylum, right? Mm-hmm. And asylum is basically like DACA, but potentially better, because you apply for asylum and then you get a work permit, right? And then it's about like 7 to 8, maybe 10 years before there's an outcome, and in that time you're in this semi-permanent status. It gives you some protection, but it's and so it lulls people into the sense of kind of security. So they're not recognized as undocumented, they therefore don't need to apply for DACA, right? But then that also DACA, because of the current political environment, has allows people more visibility, and therefore now if you're DACA eligible, you can apply for Dream.us, and that's market improvement for many people, right? But if you're an asylum seeker, you don't qualify for financial aid, and then you also don't apply for DACA, and so you're in this state of it just puts you in this predicament.
It kind of pertains to Phil's question too, of how Filipinos, even though not many of them are undocumented, many of them were formerly undocumented, and so the ways that people in my study kind of become liminally legal is they'll do like weird things like, oh, I enrolled as an English language student, and we're doing the interview in English, like they're fluent in English, and they're or they'll and at least from my study they haven't said that they're English schools, but that's also something anecdotally I've heard, that they'll Filipinos will take up training that's not really in a training school. Or like you have nursing training, but it's not really nursing training. It's like English language programs, and the way it's facilitated is you can get like the legitimate ones that actually do English training, and then you get like not so legitimate ones that are just on paper. Basically, it's a way that anecdotally I've also heard this with PT people, physical therapists, is that they'll be in law, they'll do the same strategies. So while their employer is sponsoring their H-1B, they'll use English language schools as a way, even though they're again fluent in English, as a way to kind of delay becoming undocumented. So that's one thing I don't have as much analysis on that, but
yeah, I think one thing that brings together all of the papers is the fact that people in this situation can attempt an one can confront the situation individualistically or collectively. And collectively, obviously, being involved in movements and things like that, it has all sorts of risks, but all sorts of rewards. And different groups and different individuals and it crosses cut by gender and ethnicity, have decided whether a collective strategy or an individual strategy is the best way to do it. Do you declare yourself undocumented and become part of politics? Or do you find, well, I'll do this, or I'll apply for this status, or I'll try this, or you get married, and there's individual and collective ways of dealing with it. What, of course, has happened in the last 14 months is that all of the folk wisdom about which individualistic strategy to get around this, some of which were quite effective for some people, has all changed. And I think we're seeing a huge amount of confusion coming out of that, simply because all the things we used to know that worked or didn't work have changed in a relatively short period of time for political reasons.
Hi everybody, thank you for wonderful presentations. Just want to remind you also that we need to be out of here by 5:30, so I'm going to try to be quick. You guys should be quick. We have one more question, but behind me. So I had a question for Sophia and Amy. As you know, I'm also doing a study on DACA, but we're looking, together with Shannon and Lisa, looking at really kind of the role of different mediating institutions in this process. So I'm not sure if you can answer this, but I'm going to ask you anyway because I don't have a sense from our data. I know you're focusing on CUNY, and I'm wondering to what extent, I don't think of CUNY as a monolith at all. I think there are different campus cultures and different administrators locally that have different impacts on the folks that they work with. I'm not sure if you have a sense as to, are there differences between campuses? What is driving that? Is it the folks that are, is it the administrators? Is it just something about campus culture? Like Baruch is kind of known for attracting business-focused students, which is different from Hunter, different from Queens. Love to get a sense as to what you think is going on there. Maybe we can ask the other question too, and then.
Sure, sorry. So my question is for Fanny mostly, but anyone could answer, whether it be from your research or otherwise. So talking about women in movements and such, and refugee rights for women and immigrants as well, because they, experience sometimes specifically, women-focused issues like gender-based violence or reproductive rights, or even the harassment like you mentioned. I work in civil society, so for an NGO, so focusing on these issues specifically, how do you think we can better tackle, the issues that women refugees face specifically?
So the question about the differences between CUNY campuses, I don't think we're going to be able to give you clear answers at this point. It's like a big mess. But there certainly, it does seem to obviously matter. I think that you're probably seeing as well. And some of it, but it's complicated by the fact that most of these schools are pretty big, and then you have maybe a number of staff and faculty who can really help, but it's like getting connected to those or not is a very important variable that sometimes has nothing to do with that CUNY campus, if that makes sense. So that a CUNY campus can have even a center and have programming, but there's a pattern in who accesses it, who's able to access that and who's not. That's just as important as what is available at the different CUNYs. And in terms of the different kind of character of the schools, it does matter. So some of the Baruch students have talked about being in a more conservative campus where there is anti-immigrant sentiment that is expressed in the classroom and how difficult it is. John Jay is very interesting because there's a lot of law enforcement that happens in John Jay, yet there are a number of students we interviewed who were planning to become police officers and no one told them that they have to be U.S. citizens, in our program, that we're training them. And I think that also there's a great difference between being at a 2-year school and a 4-year school that we're exploring as well as a difference between specific campuses.
Thank you for your question. In terms of what can we do, I think some of the things that the New Jersey campaign did was really great. I think talking about these issues in different ways is, there's different things that you can do. First of all is bringing in someone who's an expert on these issues in different settings, right? So if you have a community organization, or if you have a student group, or if you have an NGO or something like that, bringing in someone to inform people about these issues, because there's a lot of people, i.e. men, who just are oblivious to these kinds of issues. And even if it's not sexual harassment, right? Even if it's microaggressions, even if it's just, giving women the space to speak, or giving women the ability to be recognized for the ideas that they have. And so I think that's one thing. And I think just also providing this kind of forum for women to talk about their experiences, because very often what was raised in that particular case was that each women individually noticed that something was wrong, but they didn't talk about it together. And so each one thought that was only happening to them, and that happens all the time. And so I think providing a space as well for within that organization for women to share their experiences and then echo them back. So I think that would be a good way to go. Those are two strategies for going about it. I do want to echo if we have.
You have 10 seconds.
Okay, shameless plug to embrace my inner Justin Jess. You were talking about the perfect dreamer narrative. So I did write a paper on this about how difficult it was for the campaign, how useful the label was at the beginning of the movement, so early 2000s, and how difficult it has become for them to use it, especially in terms of recruitment. It's very hard to recruit people into a movement when you're using that narrative if you're trying to target people who might not be straight-A students, people who might not qualify for DACA. And so, so I did write a paper about that. It's called Leaving the Perfect Dreamer Behind, I think. So, thank you.
Okay. We have 5 minutes, and I can see the cleaning crew circling the room. It's Friday evening, right? I totally get it. So I want to thank this panel and Phil for moderating, and the panelists for sharing your super exciting research. I look forward where you're all taking it next, so keep us posted. Thank you all for coming out, and particularly for sticking with us through the very, very end. We did live stream the entire day. We're going to convert those live streams to videos and add them to the website. I'll keep you guys posted. We took lots of pictures. We'll add them as well. So to be continued. But thank you so very much. And a final request on your way out: take your trash with you. Help us, because many hands make light work, which also applies to the immigrant rights movement. So thank you very much.
How was the morning? Oh, really? She probably said that because that was her favorite. Oh, she's my professor. So.